In this video lesson, we'll learn about the Battle of Bull Run, the Peninsula Campaign, and the war at sea during the Civil War. Bull Run ends the 90-day war. Northern newspapers shared Lincoln's expectation of a quick victory with the headline, "On to Richmond." Union army of some 30,000 men drilled near Washington in the summer of 1861. The army was ill-prepared for the battle, but the press and public clamored for action. Lincoln eventually concluded that an attack on a smaller Confederate force at Bull Run, some 30 miles southwest of Washington, might be worth a try. If successful, it would demonstrate the superiority of Union arms and might even lead to the capture of the Confederate capital in Richmond, Virginia, which was 100 miles to the south. Raw Yankee recruits swaggered out of Washington towards Bull Run on July 21, 1861. Congressmen and spectators trailed along to witness the fun. At first, the battle went well for the Yankees, but Stonewall Jackson's gray-clad warriors stood like a stone wall, and Confederate reinforcements arrived unexpectedly. Panic seized the Union troops, many of whom fled in shameful confusion. The military picnic at Bull Run, though not decisive militarily, bore significant psychological and political consequences. Victory was worse than defeat for the South, because it inflated an already dangerous overconfidence that many Southern soldiers had. Many Southern soldiers promptly deserted, some boastfully to display their trophies, others feeling that the war was now surely going to be over quickly. Southern enlistments fell off sharply, and preparations for the conflict slackened. Defeat was better than victory for the Union, because it dispelled all illusions of a one-punch war and caused the Northerners to buckle down to the staggering task at hand. Northern hopes brightened late in 1861 when General George B. McClellan was given command of the Union Army of the Potomac, which was near Washington. As a student of warfare who was dubbed a young Napoleon, he had seen plenty of fighting, first in the Mexican War and then as an observer in the Crimean War. He was very cocky, though, and was a superb organizer and drill master, and he injected a splendid morale into the Army of the Potomac. But he was very overcautious, and he did not take a lot of risks, and he addressed the president in an arrogant tone that a less than forgiving person would never have tolerated. As McClellan continued to drill his army without moving it towards Richmond, after threatening to borrow the army if it was not going to be used, Lincoln finally issued firm orders to advance, and McClellan decides upon a waterborne approach. McClellan chose to approach Richmond, which lay at the base of a narrow peninsula formed by the James and York rivers, hence the name, the Peninsula Campaign. McClellan inched toward the Confederate capital with about 100,000 men. After taking about a month to capture Yorktown, he finally reached Richmond. At this critical juncture, Lincoln diverted McClellan's anticipated reinforcements to chase Stonewall Jackson, whose feats in the Shenandoah Valley seemed to put Washington, D.C. in jeopardy. McClellan was further frustrated when Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalry rode completely around his army in reconnaissance. Then General Robert E. Lee launched a devastating counterattack called the 7 Days Battle from June 26 to July 2, 1862. The Confederates drove McClellan back to the sea. The Union forces abandoned the Peninsula Campaign as a costly failure, and Lincoln temporarily abandoned McClellan as commander of the Army of the Potomac. General Robert E. Lee had achieved a brilliant triumph for the South, yet the ironies of this accomplishment are very striking. If McClellan had succeeded in taking Richmond and ending the war in the middle of 1862, the Union would probably have restored with minimal disruption to the peculiar institution, meaning slavery. Slavery would have survived, but his defense of Richmond and defeat of McClellan, Lee had in effect ensured that the war would endure until the Old South was destroyed. Lincoln, who had earlier professed his unwillingness to tamper with slavery where it already existed, he begins to draft an Emancipation Proclamation. Union strategy now turns towards total war. The Northern military plan had 6 components. The first component was to suffocate the South by blockading its coasts. Second, to liberate the slaves and hence undermine the very economic foundations of the Old South. Third, cut the Confederacy in half by seizing control of the Mississippi River backbone. Fourth, chop the Confederacy to pieces by sending troops through Georgia and the Carolinas. And fifth, decapitate it by capturing the capital of Richmond. And sixth, which was Ulysses Grant's idea, try everywhere to engage the enemy's main strength and to grind it down into submission. The war at sea. The blockade started leakily. It was not clamped down all at once, but began to be extended. A watertight patrol of some 3,500 miles of coast was impossible for the hastily improvised Northern Navy, which had converted yachts and ferry boats in the fleet. But blockading was simplified by concentrating on the principal ports and inlets, where dock facilities were available for loading bulky bales of cotton. How was the blockade regarded by the naval powers of the world? Ordinarily, they probably would have defied it, for it was never completely effective and especially sieve-like at the outset, but Great Britain, the greatest maritime nation, recognized it as binding and warned its shippers that they ignored it at their peril. The blockade happened to be the chief offensive weapon of Britain, which was still mistress of the seas, and Britain plainly did not want to tie its hands in a future war by insisting that Lincoln maintain impossibly high blockading standards. Blockade running soon became riskily profitable, as the growing scarcity of Southern goods drove prices skyward. The most successful blockade runners were swift gray steamers, scores of which were specifically built in Scotland and used by shippers. A leading rendezvous was the West Indies port of Nassau, in the British Bahamas. This low-lying crafts would then take on cargoes of arms brought in from Britain and leave with fraudulent papers for Halifax, Canada, and return in later with a cargo of cotton from the South. The risks were great, but the profits would mount to 700% and more. The lush days of blockade running finally passed as the Union gradually pinched off the leading southern ports from New Orleans with their high-handed practices. Yankee captains would seize British freighters on the high seas if laden with war supplies for the tiny port of Nassau or other halfway stations. The justification was that these shipments were ultimately destined by devious routes for the Confederacy, and London acquiesced in this disagreeable doctrine of ultimate destination or continuous voyage. The most alarming Confederate threat to the blockade came in 1862. Resourceful Southerners raised and reconditioned a former U.S. warship called the Merrimac and plated its sides with iron railroad rails. It was renamed the Virginia at this point. This clumsily but powerful monster, called an ironclad, easily destroyed 2 wooden ships of the Union Navy in Virginia waters and threatened catastrophe to the entire Yankee blockading fleet. A tiny Union ironclad called the Monitor, built in about 100 days, arrived on the scene, and for 4 hours on March 9, 1862, the little Yankee cheese box on a raft fought the wheezy Merrimac. Britain and France had already built several ironclads, but these were the first for the United States. This new craft heralded the doom of wooden warships, and after the historic battle, the Confederates destroyed the Merrimac to keep it from the grasp of the advancing Union troops. We'll discuss more about the ironclads and the improvements to war resources for both the North and the South in our daily lessons.